This episode was recorded in February of 2020, before states issued quarantine orders to safeguard against the spread of coronavirus. I am confident you will find today's dialogue on big data analytics and COVID-19 interesting and relevant to where we are today.
Welcome to our podcast, Journey into the Future of Medicine. I'm your host, Bill Maggio, Chief Executive Officer of the Jacobs Institute. We are a nonprofit medical device innovation center here in Buffalo, New York. Here we talk about what is possible in the next quarter century of medicine and healthcare, based on a report we published titled The Future of Medicine. Dr. Jason Davies is Research Director at the Jacobs Institute. He is also an Assistant Professor of Neurosurgery and Biomedical Informatics at the State University of New York, SUNY at Buffalo. He completed his residency training in the Department of Neurological Surgery at the University of California, San Francisco. He also completed a fellowship in endovascular neurosurgery right here in our hometown of Buffalo. Dr. Davies graduated from Stanford University with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and a minor in biological sciences. Jason's completed the MD PhD program at Stanford as well. His active research interests focus on using bioinformatics tools to advance personalized medicine. Dr. Davies has co-founded and grown several early-stage medical device and medical informatic companies, which, after listening to that bio, should come as no surprise to anyone. Jason, welcome.
Thank you very much, Bill. Glad to be here.
Did you ride your bike here today?
I wish. It's one of those dreary winter days in Buffalo, so not yet.
If there was ever a winter in Buffalo conducive for bike riding, this would be it, I would suppose.
Well, and I have been. Unfortunately, I've also been to 3 different hospitals this morning, so hard to make it efficiently.
Yeah, I understand that. But if you could, you would.
Yeah.
Jason, in 2012, the U.S. Congress defined big data as large volumes of high-velocity, complex, and variable data that requires advanced techniques and technologies to enable the capture, storage, distribution, management, and analysis of that information. What does this mean in everyday terms, and how is it used in healthcare?
Well, I think big data is something that industry has long used and has been very effective in driving change from the operational perspective, in creating markets, developing those markets, and so forth. And that's where I think these huge volumes and velocities of data are really at their best, as it were. There's been a delay in that coming to healthcare, in large part because we don't have a lot of talking between systems. There are problems there. There are privacy concerns. And so we don't have that same scale of velocity and volume that industry does. So what is actually used in healthcare? Well, we take whatever we can get. Data scientists are a little bit of opportunists. You assess what data you have. You try to understand what questions there are that could be answered with those data, and you do the best you can. It's not to say that it won't ever be the same as it is in industry writ large, but right now we're trying to do the best with what we have and lay the foundations so that we can get more and better down the road where we know it can be effective.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you raise about the systems that hospitals deploy to manage information. And I know just here locally, I mean, the Catholic Health, Kaleida, and Roswell are all on different systems. I mean, how does that burden the ability to really take advantage of where this is all going?
Well, it's terrible. I take my own clinical practice. There are probably 5 different EMRs with which we interact. There are probably 25 different imaging centers. And so getting records from these places to be able to take good care of my patients is difficult. That's on a one-by-one sort of basis where we're just trying to get data on one patient. You try to now do that for 25,000 patients at a time, and it just doesn't happen.
The audience, I probably would love to know, I mean, do you think that there's a movement amongst these big technology companies to try and get institutions like Kaleida to kind of work collaboratively? I mean, so that someday we're all on one system where we can really just share that data, because ultimately that's what's really going to drive the success here, correct?
So yes and no. The yes is there are large tech companies, for instance, Google, Microsoft, others, that want to, in their own way, democratize data. They also want the data for their own evil purposes, right? Of course, but being able to get more data is beneficial to them, and their argument is that it's also beneficial to us. And I believe that it is. But you got to have some checks on that. And the no part of the answer has to do with the existing electronic medical records companies like Cerner and Epic. These are privately held companies by and large who really have different motivations. Each separate institution has their own separate installation, and you can't talk, even with the same medical system, between institutions.
The U.S. Centers for Disease Control, as we like to call it, the CDC, announced in January of 2019, a big announcement that it will spend $17.5 million to create a network of influenza forecasting centers of excellence, with some of this real-time forecasting coming from self-reporting on social media, which is quite frankly fascinating to me. What are the other ways that real-time health information can be gathered and used, in your opinion?
So there are any number of sensors or bits of data that you could bring to fore. One of the interesting things about big data is you don't always have sort of an a priori linear link between what it is we're measuring, collecting, observing, and the end product. So the strength of big data analytics is that you can let the computer figure out what those connections are. So it could be that what you really need to know is who's going to Target and buying Colgate toothpaste. I don't know why that would mean anything for flu detection, but maybe that's a really predictive piece. And so any number of different pieces of data could come to bear and help us to be able to make better observations. Now, Google Labs several years ago did a demonstration project essentially where they were able to demonstrate that social media was very influential in being able to pick up outbreaks of things like the flu. And so social media is a very attractive target, but I think people are increasingly wearing Apple Watches, activity sensors, all sorts of different things that these wearable technologies are collecting data that could potentially be useful, looking at heart rates, temperatures, activity levels, all sorts of things that could come to bear.
Sure, that's really fascinating. I would imagine that big data, and to some degree, is playing a role, and I know this is in the forefront of everybody's mind because it's all you hear about the coronavirus. I mean, what do you think, how are we using big data right now, or how are they using big data to try and piece that puzzle together?
So lots of ways. Certainly there's been a lot of talk in the media about social media sort of predicting outbreaks and folks who are at risk and how that may or may not have been suppressed. I think that's one thing. But I think the more exciting thing that we're seeing is big data in the sense of the omics revolution, really changing how we're doing things. So the Chinese government very early on published the sequence of the coronavirus. They made it freely available. Our Centers for Disease Control, CDC in the United States, took that and developed a vaccine. Right. So before, that would have been something that took months and months and months and really wouldn't have benefited the current outbreak, but could have prevented future things. Now we have an agent that is going into trials, human trials, to be able to hopefully stem the tide of this current outbreak. It still takes time. It's still not perfect. But really being able to harness the power of the omics and the genomics, the metabolomics, the proteomics, all of those things, very early on to be able to make biomedical advances in real time. That's, I think, the exciting thing that we're seeing here.
That's fascinating to me. And as I listen to you speak, I think about if every single person on this planet had an Apple Watch on and you could tell their body temperature. Just think about just from that one measurement, what you can learn about what's happening in the world.
Yeah. Well, I was driving to the hospital yesterday listening to NPR, and they were talking about sort of what the monitoring is that's going on in these cruise ships where they've got people isolated. And it's not high-tech stuff, right? They're having them check their temperature every day, right? And it's self-reporting of symptoms. I mean, it's simple stuff. Simple stuff. Now, that's not to say that there aren't more advanced things that we could be doing, but even if you had your watch that was taking your temperature, that would be a huge start.
What is the difference between how big data analytics can be applied to individual patients versus society as a whole? I mean, in your opinion?
So one of the things that really interests me is stroke. Stroke is where you have a clot that blocks vessels to the brain and causes the brain tissue to stop working, go on to die, and so forth. And there have been a lot of studies that have gone on trying to understand who is going to have a stroke, who's at risk, and we're pretty darn poor at predicting who's going to have a stroke. There was a huge study, cost millions and millions of dollars, the Framingham Heart Study, and that has produced a set of predictors both for heart disease and, as an extension, cerebrovascular disease such as stroke. And those are really great predictors at the population level.
Remind the audience, when was that study done, the Framingham Heart Study?
It took place over decades, and they're still following them. But in the 60s, I believe, is when it was instituted. And the things that come out of that are the things that we now consider to be very obvious. Smoking, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, things like that contribute to your cardiac risk. But if you're sitting in front of me in my clinic and I say, well, you've got smoking and you've got heart disease and you've got hypertension, therefore your risk is, I can't finish that sentence because I don't know what your personal risk is and the likelihood of you having a stroke. I think the opportunity with big data as it interfaces with precision medicine is to truly be able to make personalized predictions. If I know your genetic makeup, your omics, as it were, as we talked about before, the proteomics, the metabolomics, the genomics, then I can much more accurately predict what's going to happen to you because we know so much more about how you work, how you react, and how you interface with the environment.
How far away is that, you think? I mean, where you can actually have that conversation with a 45-year-old male who smokes, who's obese, who's got high cholesterol, hypertension? So
there are some great resources out there that I think are going to make that easier. Things like a VA data set, the Million Veterans Program, where they've got all of the medical records plus some of these omics for these patients. And if we can mine those kinds of data, then our ability to develop those tools is really enhanced. The problem, going back to our first issue, is that we don't have united medical records for most of the United States population.
Goes back to what we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's about data sharing and being able to liberate the data so that you can make good use of it.
Why don't we I got to go back for a second. Why don't people want to share data? I mean, is it a competitive thing? I mean, what is it? Why can't the Catholic Health and Kaleida come together and say, we're going to share data?
Who owns the data and what's the value of those data?
Right.
I think that it comes down to that.
You could certainly protect the data. It's not an issue of HIPAA or anything like that. I mean,
You can. I mean, there are certainly liability concerns. Those can be addressed. But I think people are really concerned about, am I going to make money off of this data that is mine, right? And I think it's unfortunately some greed that's in there. But it's also a bit about I want my institution to rise to the top, and therefore I'm not going to share with others. I want mine to be the one at the top. So I think it's a bit of a combination of things.
Well, I'm going to continue to work on these people to collaborate more, certainly. What sort of work are you personally doing with big data and artificial intelligence today?
So there are a number of different initiatives. On the research front, we're working to be able to use some of the clinical data that we generate all the time to be able to make better predictions. And maybe I'll just take a second to talk about that. So as a clinician, there's a lot of art in medicine, right? It's not that I am looking at a picture and I get a number that tells me absolutely do this or absolutely do that. I look at a picture, I get an impression, and I have to figure out, okay, in this gray zone of what I'm seeing here, what's the best option? Well, what if we could take the qualitative from the tests that we do and turn it into quantitative that we could then make better predictions with? So for instance, I am a vascular neurosurgeon. I do a lot of angiograms. Those angiograms are pictures of the blood vessels of dye going through the blood vessels from artery to capillary to vein. And most of the time we discard the majority of the information that's there. We're looking for one thing, and when we see or don't see that thing, then we make a decision. Let's quantitate that qualitative information, plug the quantitative into machine learning algorithms and others, and see if we can make better choices and better decisions for the patients with that artificial intelligence. There's some things that computers do really well, some things that humans do really well. We don't need to feel threatened by what the computer does really well. Let's harness it, let's use it, and hopefully benefit the patient in the end.
In general, just for my own understanding, are most endovascular and cardiovascular docs thinking the way you're thinking about the way we need to learn to use information and think more broadly about the procedures that we perform and what we can do with that information that we're seeing as like you said, we do an angiogram, we're looking for, I assume, a clot, and so we can address that and move on.
I think there are certain specialties and certain individuals within specialties that are more on the cutting edge is one way of putting it. The other way of putting it is more willing to challenge what's already out there. If what you've got is good enough for you, then why would you adopt something new? Why would you set aside your rationale and biases to step out on a limb? I think there are a lot of folks who are hesitant to do that because much of what we see in data analytics and machine learning is what we call black box. What does that mean? That means that data goes in, the computer does something to it and spits out a prediction. Do we understand the connections? Like I said, that a priori linear thought process between inputs and outputs? No, we don't. It's black box. We don't necessarily understand why it's making the prediction it's going to. And you have to suspend your disbelief. You have to step out on that limb and you have to say, well, I'm going to trust the computer. That's scary for people. Right. And I think it's a long process to be able to overcome that fear. And it's a process that goes step by step. It's me doing some pilot projects here, saying, I think we can take better care of our patients. Let's prove it. We do the trial. I use those data to convince my partners, hey, why don't you enroll your patients in the trial as well? Because I think we're getting good results. I think we can benefit your patients. They do that. We then go to our buddies across the country at different institutions. We say, hey, look at what we've got. We think this is going to benefit your patients. Why don't you enroll your patients in our trial? And it goes forth from there. But it's really difficult to make the leap from I've got an idea to rolling it out nationwide as a new standard of care. That's a long process.
You know, we published at the Jacobs Institute, the JI Future of Medicine report, and we mentioned, black box diagnosis. Were you surprised to see that in there? I mean, we were probably happy to see that in there.
Well, I think it's something that is increasingly a reality in our world. We don't always understand, but we have to deal with the fact that they're there.
Yeah. What future potential does big data analytics hold for changing the future? I mean, it's kind of a fairly broad question, but as we start to roll towards the end of our discussion here today, just some perspective from you would be really wonderful.
So I think limitless potential in the sense that if you can imagine, you can do. And I think what needs to drive that potential to reality is we need to really identify what are the problems in our current system and how can we best address them. So there are problems everywhere. As I mentioned, we're using a lot of qualitative gut check kind of decision making that I believe could be made more quantitative and reduce the variability in care. You don't want to fly in a plane where only the best pilot's going to get you there safely. You want to participate in a system where any schmuck who passes the tests and gets the pilot's license is going to get you there safely. That's not the case in medicine. There's a lot of variability because you've got some ace fighter pilots and you've got some puddle jumpers. And we need to make it so the guys who are flying the puddle jumpers get equally good outcomes. So procedures, definitely we can reduce some of that variability with the machine learning, with the big data.
Jason, can you talk a bit about data analytics and its impact on access to care?
There is a huge problem in our society where people are not getting equivalent care because either we don't understand what's going on with them or they aren't able to get into the system and have things detected and treated appropriately. But I think big data has tremendous potential to be able to level the playing field and help everybody to get the right care in the right way at the right time.
Is it safe to say that big data is having an impact on healthcare in Western New York today? I mean, would that be a stretch to say that? Or?
It is not a stretch. It's absolutely the case. And I think the biggest places where this is coming into play are on the operations side. The Kaleida Healths, the Catholic Healths, these folks in the back offices and the C-suite, they are using it all the time, and they understand the potential of this. The challenge is getting it into the clinical environment. So it's absolutely being used, just not in a way that I think is the potential for a doc like me.
You know, it's a big world, but because of technology, it's getting smaller and smaller every day. Can we, as we wrap up this conversation, which by the way has been fascinating, I really appreciate you coming in today. I know, I can't even imagine what you've done before you even got here today. But so thank you very, very much for being here. Is it safe to say that we're solving problems faster even today because of big data, like the coronavirus thing? I come back to that because I know that's on everybody's mind. Are we coming to solutions faster today as a result of our access to these advancing technologies?
Absolutely. We're coming to solutions faster. We're finding problems faster. We are identifying needs faster. And I think all of these things are ultimately improving the health, improving the lives of people around us.
Jason, fascinating. Thank you for visiting with us this morning.
My pleasure. I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to be the first to know when there is a new episode, make sure to subscribe and recommend to a family member, friend, colleague, or your social media followers. We are so lucky to have such an engaged audience that is looking to expand their knowledge on the future of medicine. So we wanted to highlight a few of our own Podbean followers. A big shout out to Athea82 and RMW2. Thank you so much for following us along this journey into the future of medicine. We could not do what we do without listeners like you.